Robert Lawson was the kind of man everyone in his small coastal town knew. At 67, his hair had turned the color of sea foam in winter, but his eyes still carried that mischievous glint of a younger man. For decades, he'd been the sort who never sat still, always fixing something in the garage, tending to his fishing boat, or helping neighbors mend fences. But one chilly autumn morning, as he bent to lift a crate of supplies from the dock, he felt something strange. His legs trembled under the weight, his arms strained far more than they should have, and by the time he set the crate down, his breath came in shallow bursts. It wasn't the kind of fatigue that faded with a few minutes of rest. This was deeper, heavier, and unsettling in a way he couldn't shake. That night, as Robert sat in his old leather chair, he ran his hand along his forearm and noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. The firmness of muscle he once took for granted was softening. His shirt sleeves, which once hugged his arms, now hung looser. He rolled his shoulder and felt the faint ache that had been visiting him more often lately. He tried to brush it off as just getting older, but the memory of that morning on the dock clung to him. He thought of the men he'd known who had slowed down far too quickly in their later years, the ones who had gone from strong and steady to frail and dependent in what felt like the blink of an eye. The idea unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. It was a week later, at his daughter's urging, that Robert finally visited the clinic. He expected a short checkup and perhaps a mild scolding about his cholesterol or blood pressure. Instead, the doctor leaned forward and explained something Robert had never heard of before: sarcopenia. It's a gradual loss of muscle mass as we age, the doctor said gently. For most people, it starts slowly in their 40s and 50s, but by your 60s, the pace can pick up, especially if your hormones shift dramatically. The word sounded almost exotic, but its meaning landed like a stone in Robert's gut. Muscle loss wasn't just about feeling weaker, it was tied to metabolism, energy, balance, and independence. Without strong muscles, even simple things like walking up the porch steps or carrying groceries could become exhausting challenges. The doctor explained that for men like Robert, hormonal changes could sneak up quietly. Testosterone, the hormone that helped him build and maintain muscle for decades, had been drifting lower for years without him noticing. Melatonin, the hormone he thought only mattered for sleep, was also declining, and without it, his body's natural ability to protect and restore muscle was fading. The idea that his body was quietly dismantling the very strength he had relied on all his life left him both startled and strangely determined. He wasn't ready to let go of the life he loved, not yet, not without a fight. That evening, Robert sat on his porch, watching the sun melt into the horizon. He thought about his father, who had grown thin and frail in his later years, unable to lift even a bucket of water without wincing. Robert had always assumed that was just the way life went, but now a flicker of hope stirred in him. If muscle loss was partly about hormones, metabolism, and lifestyle, maybe there was something he could do, some way to slow it down or even push back against it. He didn't want to be the man who gave up fishing because his arms couldn't haul in the net, or who stopped helping neighbors because a ladder felt too heavy to carry. Over the next few days, Robert began noticing little signs everywhere. Rising from a low chair took more effort than it once had. He reached for a heavy skillet in the kitchen and felt the same tremor in his arms that had startled him at the dock. Even the simple joy of carrying his granddaughter on his shoulders now felt like a test of endurance. These moments were tiny, almost invisible to anyone else, but to Robert they were warnings. He began reading everything he could about muscle preservation, aging, and hormones. It felt like opening a door into a world he hadn't known existed, a world where science and nature worked together to protect vitality. One crisp morning, Robert stopped by to see his old friend, Dr. Collins, a retired physician who had known him since boyhood. They sat at the kitchen table over steaming mugs of tea, and Robert poured out his worries. Dr. Collins listened without interruption, then began to speak in the way only an old friend could. Warm, plain-spoken, and with the weight of experience. He explained how both men and women faced hormonal shifts that could quietly strip away their strength. For women, menopause often marked the sharpest drop, estrogen and progesterone falling rapidly. For men, the decline was slower but just as dangerous, with testosterone, melatonin, and growth hormone all dwindling in tandem. As they talked, Robert realized something that would shape his journey. This wasn't just about eating better or staying active. It was about understanding the subtle ways the body changes with time and finding gentle but powerful ways to work with it, not against it. Dr. Collins spoke of light, the infrared rays of the sun that could spark melatonin production. He described the quiet heroism of resistance training, how it could signal the body to keep building and repairing muscle. He even spoke about cholesterol, a nutrient Robert had spent years avoiding, but which was essential for making the very hormones that preserved his strength. By the time Robert left, a quiet determination had settled in his chest. He didn't feel panicked anymore. He felt armed. He understood now that the choice wasn't between surrendering to age or chasing impossible youth. The real choice was whether to live these years with energy, steadiness, and dignity. That meant making small, deliberate changes, moving his body against resistance every day, nourishing himself with the right foods, giving his hormones the raw materials they needed, and soaking up the light that nature offered freely. As the days turned into weeks, Robert began weaving these changes into his routine. He dusted off the old set of resistance bands in the garage. He made room on his plate for rich, wholesome foods he had once shunned. He walked in the early morning sun, letting its warmth soak into his skin. Each of these changes felt small on its own, but together they began to stitch a new pattern into his life. He could feel the difference not only in his muscles, but in his spirit. The heaviness that had settled on him that day at the dock was lifting. In its place was a quiet, steady strength. Not the reckless strength of youth, but something wiser, more enduring. And so Robert's journey began, not with a grand resolution or a dramatic overhaul, but with a series of humble steps guided by understanding. He knew the road ahead would still hold its challenges. There would be days when the aches returned, when progress felt slow. But he also knew that every sunrise, every walk in the light, every deliberate lift and pull against resistance was an act of defiance against the quiet thief called sarcopenia. And in that defiance, Robert found something worth holding on to, the belief that age may bend the body, but it doesn't have to break the spirit. Robert Lawson had always been proud of his endurance. For most of his life, he could haul lobster traps from his boat without thinking about it, carry sacks of potatoes from the market, or walk the 2 miles from his home to the pier and back without needing to pause. But over the past few years, something had changed, so quietly that at first he didn't even notice. It was in the way his hands trembled just a little when lifting a full kettle, the slight breathlessness he felt when climbing the 3 steps to his porch, the faint, nagging ache in his thighs after standing too long. These were small moments, easy to brush aside with the excuse of just getting older. But deep down, Robert knew this was something different. The realization struck one afternoon when he visited the local hardware store. He had gone to pick up a new anchor chain for his fishing boat, something he had done many times over the years. This time, though, as he tried to lift the coiled metal from the floor, his arms shook with effort. He managed to get it into his cart, but his heart was thudding hard and there was a strange heaviness in his chest. He glanced around to see if anyone noticed, a flicker of embarrassment passing over his face. It wasn't just the weight of the chain, it was the weight of the truth sinking in. That night, he found himself lying awake, staring at the wooden beams of his bedroom ceiling. Memories of his father crept into his mind, how the old man had slowed down in his 60s, how his shoulders had narrowed, how his strong fisherman's hands had grown bony and thin. Robert remembered the day his father dropped a basket of fish because his grip gave out, and how he had never gone back out to sea alone after that. Was that the road Robert was heading down? The thought tightened his chest. It was a few days later, during Sunday lunch at his daughter Emily's house, that she noticed something too. He had struggled a little to lift his youngest grandson, Max, into his arms. "Dad, are you okay? You seem weaker lately," she said gently, her eyes searching his face. Robert forced a smile and waved her off, muttering something about being tired from the morning's chores. But the truth was, her words stuck with him. It wasn't just his imagination, other people were starting to see it too. The following week, he decided to bring it up with Dr. Collins, his longtime family doctor and friend. As they sat in the small, sunlit examination room, Robert explained how his strength seemed to be slipping away, how everyday tasks felt just a little harder than before. Dr. Collins listened carefully, nodding slowly. "Robert," he began in that calm, measured voice Robert had always trusted, "what you're describing is something I see often. It's not sudden. It creeps up on you. Little by little, your muscles lose their power. We call it muscle loss related to aging, and it happens to everyone, though the speed can vary. The dangerous part is how quietly it happens. You don't notice it at first until one day you realize you can't do what you used to. Robert leaned back in his chair, taking in the words. But why? I've stayed active. I still walk to the pier every morning. Dr. Collins smiled softly. It's not about whether you still move, Robert. It's about how your body changes with age. As the years pass, the signals that tell your muscles to stay strong grow weaker. The machinery inside you that builds and repairs muscle slows down. And if you're not doing the right things to counter it, the loss accelerates. He paused, letting the words settle. Think of it like the tide. You can't stop it from coming in or going out, but you can work with it and you can prepare for it so it doesn't catch you off guard. As Robert walked home that afternoon, he thought about what Dr. Collins had said. It made sense. The signs had been there, the trembling hands, the heavier breathing, the looseness of his once solid arms. But because they had crept in so slowly, he had learned to live with them. He had ignored the little hints, the quiet messages his body had been sending. And now the loss had caught up to him enough for others to see. That evening, Robert sat at his kitchen table with a pen and notepad, something he hadn't done since his fishing days when he used to track tides and weather patterns. This time, he started listing the moments when he had felt weaker, lifting Max, carrying the anchor chain, climbing the porch steps. Seeing it written down made it real in a way his thoughts alone had not. He could feel a mixture of sadness and determination rising in his chest. Sadness for what seemed to be slipping away, but determination not to let it go without a fight. He poured himself a cup of tea and stared out at the horizon, the sun painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. All right, he murmured to himself, if age wants to take my strength, it's going to have to work for it. That night, for the first time in months, he slept soundly. He had no plan yet, no roadmap, but he had taken the first step, naming the problem and deciding it wasn't going to define him. In the days that followed, Robert found himself more aware of his movements. When he lifted something, he paid attention to how his muscles responded. When he walked, he noticed the pace of his steps. He didn't like all that he saw. There was stiffness, slowness, and more fatigue than he cared to admit. But instead of turning away from it, he faced it. Because now he knew. Aging was stealing his strength, but it wasn't doing it loudly. It was doing it quietly, stealthily. And if he wanted to keep the life he loved, he would have to learn how to steal it back. And that, Robert decided, was exactly what he was going to do. Robert Lawson had always assumed that age simply wore down the body like wind wearing away a stone. You couldn't see it happening day to day, but over the years it shaped everything. Still, he had never thought much about what was happening inside him, about the silent, invisible shifts in the chemicals and signals that kept him feeling strong. That changed one blustery afternoon when he found himself back in Dr. Collins's office for a follow-up visit. Dr. Collins leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen thoughtfully. Robert, he began, I want to explain something important, something that happens to everyone, but that most men and women don't realize until it's already caused problems. It's about hormones. Think of them as the body's internal messengers. They control so much. How you build muscle, how you recover from effort, even how you sleep. Robert listened, his brow furrowed. Hormones? I thought those were more of a women's thing, he said hesitantly. A slow smile spread across Dr. Collins' face. That's what many men think. But men have their own critical hormones too. Testosterone, growth hormone, melatonin. And here's the truth. After about age 50 for women and 60 for men, these levels start to change in ways that can really sap your strength. For women, menopause triggers a sharp drop in estrogen and progesterone. For men, the fall is more gradual, but just as significant over time. That's why women might feel a sudden shift in their 50s, while men often don't notice until their 60s. But by then, the decline has been underway for years. Robert leaned forward. So, you're telling me my strength isn't just about muscles? It's about these hormones? Dr. Collins nodded. Exactly. Your hormones are like the foreman on a construction site. If the foreman stops giving clear instructions, the workers, your muscles, don't know what to do. Repairs slow down, new building slows down, and little by little, things start to crumble. Dr. Collins went on to describe something that surprised Robert even more. It's not just testosterone, he said. One of the most overlooked hormones in men your age is melatonin. Robert chuckled. Melatonin? That's the sleep pill, isn't it? That's the popular view, Dr. Collins replied. But the truth is, melatonin does much more than help you drift off at night. It's a powerful protector of your cells, especially the mitochondria, the energy engines in your muscles. When melatonin drops, and it drops about tenfold as we age, you lose some of that protection. That's why older people often have more muscle fatigue, poorer recovery, and weaker endurance. Robert sat back, letting the information sink in. He remembered how, in the past few years, his sleep had grown lighter. He often woke before dawn and couldn't get back to sleep. Could that be connected to his fading strength? Dr. Collins nodded again, as though reading his thoughts. And here's something else. Men your age often have lower testosterone and growth hormone levels and higher stress hormone levels like cortisol. That imbalance pushes the body toward breaking down muscle instead of building it. He leaned in a little closer. That's why it's not enough to just be active. You have to understand what's happening and work with it. The conversation left Robert thoughtful for the rest of the day. He walked home slower than usual, feeling the wind whip around his coat collar, thinking about all the quiet changes happening in his body. It was unsettling, but there was also a strange sense of relief. At least now, the puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. His fading strength wasn't a personal failure. It wasn't laziness. It was biology. That night, over dinner with his daughter Emily and her husband, Robert decided to share what he'd learned. Emily listened carefully, nodding. "So it's like your body's command system is slowing down?" she asked. "Exactly," Robert said, smiling at how quickly she grasped it. "And if I can find ways to give those commands again, or at least stop them from fading so fast, I might be able to keep my strength." The following morning, Robert found himself awake before sunrise again, but this time, instead of tossing and turning, he decided to sit on the porch and watch the day arrive. As the first pale light stretched over the horizon, he thought about something Dr. Collins had mentioned: the role of light in helping the body make melatonin. The sun, Collins had said, is one of your best allies. Just sitting in its early light each day helps reset your natural rhythms, which in turn supports the hormones that keep you strong. Robert realized he had taken sunlight for granted. He had always been outside as a fisherman, but now he spent more time indoors, tinkering in the garage, reading in his armchair. That morning, he sat quietly, letting the first rays warm his face, imagining each beam whispering to his body, "Wake up, rebuild, restore." Over the next few days, Robert made it a point to catch the morning sun, even if only for a few minutes. He noticed something unexpected. He felt calmer in the afternoons, less restless at night. The sleep still wasn't perfect, but it was deeper, steadier. And with better rest, his mornings felt lighter. The changes were subtle, but they were there, like the first green shoots in early spring. One evening, as Robert stood in his small backyard, he thought again about what Dr. Collins had said. If you understand what's changing, you can respond before it's too late. He knew now that the slow drain on his strength was tied to these invisible hormonal tides, and tides, he thought with a fisherman's certainty, could be read, timed, and worked with. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had begun to see the map. And for Robert Lawson, that was enough to take the next step in his fight to keep the life and the strength he loved. Robert Lawson had never spent much time comparing the way men and women aged. In his mind, everyone grew older in much the same way. Hair turned gray, joints stiffened, strength faded. But after his recent talks with Dr. Collins, he began to realize that while the destination was the same, the roads men and women traveled to get there were quite different, and those differences mattered more than he'd ever thought. It was during another quiet conversation at Dr. Collins' clinic that this truth sank in. Robert had come by to ask about some changes he'd noticed in his sleep and energy. Collins listened patiently, then leaned back in his chair and began to explain. "Robert," he said, "think of aging in men and women like the changing of the seasons. Women go from summer to autumn almost overnight. Men take a long, winding road, moving slowly from season to season. But in both cases, the weather changes, and so does the landscape." Robert frowned slightly. "You're talking about hormones again, aren't you?" Collins chuckled. "Yes. In women, the big turning point is menopause. Somewhere around 50, give or take a few years, estrogen and progesterone levels drop sharply. It's like someone flipped a switch. They can feel it almost immediately. Hot flashes, mood changes, muscle loss, changes in skin and hair. Men, on the other hand, don't have that one big event. Your testosterone, melatonin, and growth hormone levels start to slide in your 40s, but the drop is slow. The trouble is, because it's slow, men like you often don't notice until the loss has piled up. Robert sat back in his chair, thinking about the women he knew, his sister Margaret for one. She had often spoken about how suddenly her body had changed in her early 50s. He remembered her saying, "It felt like my strength just left me one morning." Now he understood why, and he began to see himself in the opposite pattern, not a sudden loss, but a steady trickle that had gone on for years, until one day he looked up and realized the well was half empty. Collins continued, "There's another thing, Robert. Before menopause, women have a protective advantage in certain areas, especially with their nervous system and muscle health. Progesterone and estrogen act like shields, but after menopause, those shields weaken, and women's risk for conditions like osteoporosis or even neurological issues catches up to men's. For men, testosterone plays a similar protective role. When it drops too low, you not only lose muscle, but also the ability to bounce back from illness or injury." Robert felt a twinge of worry. He thought about the times over the past few years when a simple cold had knocked him flat for a week, or when his sore shoulder had taken months to heal after a minor strain. He had blamed it on bad luck or just age, but now he realized there might be more to it. That evening, Robert found himself at Emily's house for dinner. His daughter had always been curious about what he was learning, so over roast chicken and potatoes, he began to share. "You know, Em," he said thoughtfully, "men and women don't lose strength the same way. For women, it's like a cliff. For men, it's like a slow slope. Both end up in the valley if you don't do anything, but the journey feels different." Emily raised an eyebrow. "So for you, it's been creeping up for years?" Robert nodded. "Exactly, and I didn't see it until now." Emily glanced toward her mother's old photograph on the mantel. "That explains a lot about what Mom went through," she said quietly. Robert gave a small smile. "Yes, and it explains a lot about me, too." The next morning, Robert sat on the porch with his coffee, watching the light spill over the rooftops. He thought about all the times he had dismissed his tiredness or his slower pace as just getting old. If the change had been sudden, maybe he would have acted sooner. But because it was slow, it had felt harmless. He realized now that this slow drift was exactly what made it dangerous. It lulled you into ignoring it until too much was gone. Later that week, Robert returned to Dr. Collins with a question. "If men and women lose strength differently," he asked, "does that mean they should fight it differently?" Collins nodded. "Yes and no. The fundamentals are the same. Keep moving, eat well, protect your hormones, and rest properly. But the timing and urgency are different. Women often need to act quickly at menopause to protect their bones and muscles. Men need to be vigilant earlier than they think, ideally starting in their 40s, because by the time they feel the loss, a lot has already happened." This struck Robert deeply. He thought of his fishing days again, how the tides could look still on the surface while the current underneath was already carrying you out to sea. By the time you noticed, you were far from shore. That was how his strength had slipped away, not in one storm, but in a quiet, steady pull. Walking home that day, Robert decided he was done letting the current take him without a fight. It didn't matter that the shift for men was slower. What mattered was catching it and working against it now. He felt a small thrill of determination, the same feeling he'd had as a young man when steering his boat into a challenging wind. As the weeks went by, Robert began to talk more openly with friends about what he was learning. Some laughed it off, others listened closely. A few men admitted they'd noticed the same creeping changes, but had never thought about hormones being involved. "It's not about being less of a man," Robert told them one evening at the cafe. "It's about understanding what's going on inside you so you can keep doing the things you love." That night, Robert wrote in his notebook again, something he had started to do more often. On the page, he scribbled, "Women fall off the cliff. Men slide down the hill, but both can climb back up, if they start climbing before they hit the bottom." He closed the book with a sense of quiet resolve. He didn't know exactly how the climb would go, but he knew the direction he needed to take. And for now, that was enough. The word sounded strange to Robert the first time Dr. Collins said it. Sarcopenia. It rolled off the tongue like a medical term out of some textbook he'd never read. But the moment Collins explained what it meant, Robert felt it settle heavily in his mind. "It comes from Greek," the doctor had said. "Sarx means flesh, and penia means loss or poverty. Put together, it means poverty of the flesh." In other words, losing the very muscle tissue that keeps you strong and mobile. Robert had always thought of poverty in terms of money or possessions, but poverty of the flesh, that was different. That was losing something far more personal, something that couldn't be bought back once it was gone. It was losing the ability to haul in a net full of fish, to lift his grandson high into the air, to walk down the pier without his legs wobbling. In the days after hearing the word, Robert found himself repeating it in his head. Poverty of the flesh. It made him look at his own body in a new light. One morning, as he buttoned his shirt, he noticed how his shoulders seemed narrower than they had a few years ago, how the fabric no longer pulled snug across his chest. His forearms, once thick from years of working with ropes and nets, had lost some of their shape. None of this had happened overnight, but now that he was aware of it, the changes seemed impossible to ignore. Dr. Collins had told him that sarcopenia wasn't just about muscles getting smaller. It was about what happened when those muscles weakened, the chain reaction that followed. When you lose muscle, Collins had explained, you lose strength. When you lose strength, you lose balance. And when you lose balance, the risk of falling skyrockets. That's how many older adults end up injured and unable to recover fully. It's not just about looking strong. It's about being able to live without fear of falling or needing help for the simplest things. That point hit Robert harder than he expected. His neighbor George had fallen on his front steps the year before. The broken hip had taken months to heal, and George never fully got back the confidence to walk without a cane. Robert had visited him in the hospital and seen the frustration in his eyes. He didn't want that to be his future. One crisp Saturday morning, Robert decided to test himself. He set his coffee down and stood in the middle of his living room. "All right," he muttered under his breath, "let's see how the old legs are doing." He tried standing from his chair without using his hands, something he remembered doing effortlessly in his younger years. To his dismay, it was harder than he thought. His thighs trembled, his knees wobbled slightly, and he felt a surprising surge of relief when he finally stood upright. Later that afternoon, he mentioned it to Emily when she stopped by with the kids. "Dad," she said gently, "you're still strong, but maybe you just need to work those muscles more." Robert gave a half smile. "That's exactly what Collins says. The trick is figuring out how to do it in a way that works for me now, not the me from 30 years ago." Collins had given him another perspective that stuck in his mind. Sarcopenia begins earlier than most people think, Robert. Some studies suggest it starts as early as your 30s. You just don't see the signs until later. By the time you notice, the loss has already been happening for decades. The good news is you can slow it, and in some cases even reverse parts of it, but you have to take it seriously. That night, Robert pulled out an old photo album. There was a picture of him in his 40s, standing on the deck of his boat with a huge striped bass in his hands. His arms looked solid, his posture straight, his legs sturdy. He compared that image to the reflection he saw now in the hallway mirror. The difference wasn't devastating, he wasn't frail yet, but it was undeniable. He realized that if he wanted to avoid true poverty of the flesh, he needed to act while he still had something to preserve. The next morning, Robert took a walk along the pier. The gulls wheeled overhead, calling out as they always had. But the world felt a little sharper to him now. He stopped by a bench, sat for a moment, and thought about all the small freedoms his muscles gave him. The freedom to carry groceries without thinking, the freedom to climb a ladder to fix a roof shingle, the freedom to lift Max into the air and hear him squeal with laughter. Losing those freedoms wasn't an option he could accept. Back at home, Robert took out a notepad and wrote a single sentence at the top. "I will not let sarcopenia steal my independence." Underneath, he began jotting ideas. Things Collins had mentioned, small habits he could start immediately. He didn't think of it as a formal exercise plan, just a promise to himself to move every day, to challenge his muscles, to keep them working for him instead of against him. That afternoon, Emily stopped by again. She found her father standing in the backyard, lifting a pair of small dumbbells he'd dug out of the garage. "What's this?" she asked with a smile. Robert grinned. "Insurance," he said, "against poverty of the flesh." In that moment, Robert felt something shift inside him. The word sarcopenia no longer felt like a shadow looming over his future. It felt like a challenge, one he could meet with steady determination, day by day, lift by lift, step by step. Robert Lawson had never thought much about estrogen or progesterone. In his mind, those were women's hormones, the kind of thing doctors discussed with his sister or late wife, not with him. But one breezy afternoon, as he sat in Dr. Collins' small consulting room, he learned that those hormones played a role in muscle health for everyone, and that understanding them was a missing piece in his puzzle. Dr. Collins leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Robert, I know you're focused on your own strength and the changes you're feeling as a man, but there's something you need to know. Estrogen and progesterone aren't just about reproduction. They affect your muscles, your bones, your joints, and even your nervous system." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Even for men," Collins smiled. "Even for men. But the story is most dramatic in women, and understanding it will help you see the full picture." Collins explained how, in women, estrogen acts almost like a repair crew for the body's tissues. It helps maintain muscle, supports collagen in the skin and connective tissue, and even keeps cartilage healthy in the joints. When estrogen drops sharply at menopause, the loss isn't just about hot flashes or mood changes. Muscles lose some of their ability to repair, skin and connective tissue lose elasticity, and the body becomes more prone to injuries. Robert thought of his sister Margaret again, how she had complained in her early 50s about aches and stiffness that seemed to come out of nowhere. He remembered how her once strong arms had slimmed down, not because she stopped using them, but because they seemed to fade on their own. Then Collins spoke about progesterone, the quieter partner in the hormone dance. Progesterone drops even more steeply than estrogen during menopause. And while it's less talked about, it has powerful effects. It's a neuroprotective hormone, meaning it helps shield the brain and nerves. It also works alongside estrogen to maintain balance in the body's tissues. When progesterone falls to near zero, the protective effects disappear, and the impact on muscles, joints, and even coordination can be profound. Robert leaned back in his chair, letting the information sink in. "So when women lose these hormones, their muscles lose more than just bulk?" Collins nodded. "Exactly. They lose resilience, and while men don't have the same sharp drop, our hormones also play a similar protective role. Testosterone, of course, is our main muscle-building hormone, but a small amount of estrogen, which men produce from testosterone, helps keep our tissues supple and our joints moving smoothly." The conversation lingered in Robert's mind for days. He realized that muscle loss wasn't just about not lifting enough weight or eating enough protein. It was about the subtle, quiet support that hormones provided. Support that could vanish almost overnight for women and slowly ebb away for men. One evening, over dinner at Emily's, Robert found himself talking about it. "You know," he said, passing the salad bowl, "I always thought hormones were just, well, something women talked about. But Collins says they affect muscles, bones, even nerves. When they drop, it's like pulling the scaffolding out from under a building." Emily looked up, intrigued. "So that's part of why Mom's strength changed so quickly?" Robert nodded. "Exactly. And it's why mine has been changing more slowly, but just as surely." That night, Robert pulled out the old family photo albums again. He found a picture of himself and Margaret taken 20 years earlier at a summer barbecue. Both of them were laughing, holding plates piled high with food, looking strong and healthy. He compared it to a photo taken just last year. Margaret's face was still bright, but her posture had changed, her shoulders narrower, her arms thinner. Robert realized she had been living through the sudden drop he'd just learned about, and he was walking the slower, quieter version of that path himself. The next time Robert visited Collins, he asked, "So if these hormones are dropping, can you get them back?" Collins smiled carefully. "That's a bigger conversation, Robert. For some people, hormone therapy can help, but it has to be done with care, especially at your age. The goal isn't to flood the body with hormones, it's to support the natural balance as much as possible. Sometimes, lifestyle changes can make a bigger difference than people expect." Robert left the clinic that day thinking about how interconnected everything was. Muscles didn't just shrink on their own, they were tied to bones, to joints, to hormones, to nerves, to an entire system that was shifting with age. And if one part of that system faltered, the rest would feel it sooner or later. That evening, he sat in his backyard with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn dusky blue. He thought of the years he had spent out on the water, how every part of the boat had to work together. The sails, the ropes, the rudder, the hull. If one piece weakened, the whole journey could be thrown off. His body, he realized, was no different. Understanding the hidden role of estrogen and progesterone didn't just give him more knowledge. It gave him a deeper respect for the quiet, unseen forces that had been keeping him strong all these years. And with that respect came a renewed determination to protect what was left and to strengthen what he could while he still could. Robert Lawson had spent most of his adult life hearing that cholesterol was the enemy. Every magazine article, every health segment on the evening news seemed to say the same thing. Cut it down, avoid it, keep it as low as possible. When his doctor years ago had warned him about borderline cholesterol, Robert had dutifully switched to skim milk, trimmed the fat from his meat, and even tried margarine instead of butter. He believed he was doing the right thing, but sitting in Dr. Collins' office now, he was hearing something that made him question everything he thought he knew. "Robert," Collins began gently, "cholesterol isn't your enemy. In fact, for someone in your position, it's one of your best allies." Robert chuckled in disbelief. "You're telling me I should eat more of the stuff?" Collins smiled. "I'm telling you that without enough cholesterol, your body can't make the hormones that keep you strong. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, they're all built from cholesterol. Think of it as the raw lumber your body uses to build the house. No lumber, no house." Robert leaned back, feeling a bit like the floor had shifted beneath him. "So all those years I was cutting it down." Collins nodded. "You may have been starving the very system that helps preserve your muscles. Low cholesterol can mean low hormone production, and low hormones mean faster muscle loss." That evening, Robert sat at his kitchen table, thinking back over the past decade. He remembered how proud he'd felt swapping bacon for oatmeal, whole milk for almond milk, butter for spreads that promised heart-healthy benefits. He had been following what he thought was the smart, responsible path. But now he wondered if that path had been quietly draining his strength. The next morning, over coffee, Robert called his daughter, Emily. "You're not going to believe what Collins told me," he began. She listened as he explained the link between cholesterol and hormones. "So, Dad," she asked slowly, "does that mean butter's back on the menu?" Robert laughed. "Apparently so, though I'm not about to live on nothing but bacon and cheese. But I think it's time I stop fearing the foods that my body actually needs." Later that week, Robert visited the local farmer's market. He found himself drawn to the fresh eggs, the creamy blocks of cheese, and a slab of grass-fed beef from a vendor he trusted. As he carried his purchases home, he thought about how strange it felt to buy these foods without guilt. For years, he had seen them as indulgences. Now he saw them as tools to help him keep the life he loved. Of course, Collins had been clear about one thing: balance was still important. "Robert," he'd said, "there's a difference between healthy sources of cholesterol and foods that come with too much processed fat or sugar. Focus on quality: eggs, fish, grass-fed meat, dairy from good sources. These nourish your body without overloading it with things it doesn't need." One evening, Robert decided to put his new understanding into practice. He cooked himself a simple dinner, a couple of eggs fried in butter, a side of sauté spinach, and a small piece of salmon. As he ate, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not just from the food itself, but from the knowledge that he was feeding his body with purpose. A few days later, Robert mentioned the change to his neighbor George, who had been dealing with his own muscle loss. "I thought cholesterol was bad for you," George said with a frown. Robert nodded. "That's what I thought too. But Collins says without it, our bodies can't make the hormones we need to keep our muscles. It's like trying to run a boat without fuel." George mulled that over, then grinned. "So you're saying a little butter won't kill me?" Robert laughed. "I'm saying it might just help you lift that bag of mulch without pulling your back." Robert knew the changes wouldn't happen overnight, but already something in his mindset had shifted. He no longer saw cholesterol as a threat to be eliminated. He saw it as part of the foundation, a material his body needed to keep building and repairing the muscles that carried him through each day. One Sunday morning, as Robert stood at the stove making scrambled eggs for Emily and the grandkids, he thought about how much of life was like this, relearning what you thought you already knew. Sometimes the rules you'd live by turned out to be only part of the truth. And sometimes letting go of old fears was the first step toward rebuilding something stronger. As he slid the eggs onto plates and called everyone to the table, Robert felt lighter somehow. Not because his problems were solved, but because he had one more piece of the puzzle in place. The road ahead still stretched long and uncertain, but now he knew he didn't have to walk it empty-handed. He had the knowledge, the tools, and yes, the cholesterol to help keep his muscles and his life from slipping quietly away. Robert Lawson had never questioned the little white pill he took each evening with a glass of water. It was a statin prescribed years ago to help keep his cholesterol in check. His old doctor had said it was important for his heart health, and Robert, trusting the advice, had never argued. But after his recent talk with Dr. Collins about cholesterol being essential for hormones and muscle preservation, a troubling thought began to gnaw at him. Could this pill be working against me? It was during his next visit that Robert decided to bring it up. He leaned back in the worn leather chair in Collins' office and said, "Doc, you told me cholesterol helps make hormones, but I've been taking statins for years to lower it. Could that be part of the reason I'm losing strength?" Collins' expression softened. "Robert, I'm glad you asked. Statins do lower cholesterol, and for some people, that's very important to reduce the risk of heart disease. But there's a trade-off. When you reduce cholesterol too much, your body has less raw material to make certain hormones: testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and in some people, statins can cause a side effect called muscle myopathy, basically muscle weakness or even muscle damage." Robert felt a chill. "So the very pill I'm taking to stay healthy could be weakening me?" Collins nodded slowly. "It's possible. Not everyone experiences it, but enough do that it's something worth paying attention to. That's why I always balance the risks and benefits for each patient. Your heart health is important, but so is your muscle health and your ability to live independently." Walking home later, Robert couldn't stop thinking about it. He thought of the mornings when he woke with a dull ache in his thighs, or the way his arms seemed to tire faster when lifting grocery bags. Could these have been quiet warnings his body was giving him all along? That evening, Robert mentioned it to Emily over dinner. "So you're telling me the medicine you've been taking for years might actually be hurting your muscles?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Robert nodded. "It's not certain, but it's possible. And the thing is, no one ever told me that before." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "What are you going to do?" Robert sighed. "Collins says we'll review my dosage and see if I even still need it. Maybe there's another way to manage my heart health that doesn't risk my strength." Over the next week, Robert began paying closer attention to how his body felt. He noticed that his legs tired halfway through his daily walk to the pier. He noticed the faint soreness in his calves after climbing the porch steps. None of it was crippling, but it was there, and now that he was aware of the possible link, he couldn't ignore it. One afternoon, he met his old fishing buddy Frank at the cafe. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Robert shared what he'd learned. Frank's eyes widened. "You know, I've been on statins for years too," Frank said, "and lately my legs have been feeling weaker. I figured it was just age." Robert shook his head. "That's what I thought too, but maybe it's worth asking your doctor. I think we both deserve to know if the cure's been chipping away at us." The following week, Collins called with Robert's latest blood work results. "Your cholesterol's well controlled," Collins said, "but your hormone markers are on the lower side for your age. That could be part of what we're seeing in your muscle loss. Let's try lowering your statin dose and see how your body responds over the next few months. And I want you to focus on resistance training and nutrition in the meantime." Robert hung up the phone feeling strangely relieved. It wasn't a complete answer yet, but it was a start. For the first time in years, he felt like he had some control over this part of his health. He wasn't just swallowing a pill because someone told him to. He was making decisions with a clearer understanding of what was at stake. That night, Robert sat at his kitchen table with his notepad again. He wrote down 3 simple goals: build muscle, protect hormones, keep heart healthy. It seemed like a delicate balance, but he was determined to find it. The next morning, as Robert walked to the pier, the sun warming his shoulders, he thought about how many people his age might be in the same position, doing their best to follow their doctor's orders without realizing that sometimes the treatment could have side effects that quietly stole their strength. He made a silent promise to himself. He would share what he learned, not to scare anyone, but to remind them that health wasn't just about taking pills. It was about asking questions, understanding your own body, and making sure every step you took was leading you toward the life you wanted, not away from it. And so, Robert Lawson took another small but important step in his journey. This time, it wasn't about lifting more weight or eating a certain food. It was about lifting the veil on something he had never thought to question, and realizing that sometimes the most important strength you can have is the strength to ask why. Robert Lawson had always thought of melatonin as nothing more than a sleep pill. He'd seen the little bottles in the pharmacy, usually tucked between herbal teas and vitamin C. He'd never taken it himself, but he knew people who swore by it for jet lag or restless nights. To him, it was something you used if you couldn't get to sleep, nothing more. That belief changed one breezy autumn morning during another talk with Dr. Collins. "Robert," Collins began, "you've been asking a lot about hormones lately, and we've covered testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, even cholesterol. But there's another piece of the puzzle I think you're missing: melatonin." Robert chuckled. "You mean the sleep stuff?" Collins smiled knowingly. "That's what most people think. But melatonin is more than just your body's lullaby. It's a powerful antioxidant, and one of its most important jobs is protecting your mitochondria, the energy factories inside your cells. Those mitochondria are especially dense in your muscles because your muscles need a lot of energy to move and repair. When melatonin levels drop, your muscles lose some of that protection. Over time, that can mean slower recovery, more fatigue, and yes, weaker muscles." Robert leaned forward, frowning. "So you're saying my sleep hormone is tied to my muscle strength?" "Exactly," Collins said. "And here's the part that surprises most people. Your melatonin levels drop by about tenfold as you get older. When you were in your 20s, you had plenty. By the time you're in your 60s, the supply is a fraction of what it used to be." Robert sat back, trying to take it in. He thought about the past few years, how his sleep had become lighter, how he often woke before dawn, and how he felt more drained during the day. "Maybe it wasn't just old age after all," Collins went on. "There's another wrinkle here. Two other hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, tend to skyrocket in older men, and that can disrupt your hormone balance even more. One of the ways to help keep them in check is by supporting healthy melatonin levels." Robert scratched his chin. "All right, so how do I get more melatonin? Do I just buy a bottle from the store?" Collins shook his head. "Supplements can help in some cases, but the most natural and powerful way is through light, specifically infrared light. More than half the sun's rays are infrared, and they penetrate deep into your body, even through your skull. This light helps your body produce and regulate melatonin naturally. Sitting by a sunny window in the morning, taking a walk outdoors, even enjoying the glow of a fireplace or candlelight in the evening, all of these can help." Robert thought about how much of his time he spent indoors lately. In his fishing days, he had lived in the sunlight from dawn to dusk. Now, most mornings were spent at the kitchen table, sipping coffee while reading the paper. Maybe, he thought, he had been starving his body of something it had always counted on. That afternoon, Robert decided to test the theory. Instead of sitting in his usual spot by the window, he stepped outside with his coffee. The air was cool, but the morning sun spilled warmly over his face and hands. He stood there for 10 minutes, eyes closed, breathing in the crisp, salt-tinged air. It felt good, not just in a fresh air kind of way, but in a deeper, calmer way he couldn't quite explain. Over the next week, Robert made a habit of it. Every morning, he'd step outside for a short walk around the block or sit in the backyard with his coffee, letting the sun reach his skin. In the evenings, he began turning off the harsh overhead lights earlier, lighting a few candles instead. It felt almost old-fashioned, but there was a peacefulness to it. By the second week, he noticed something interesting. He was falling asleep faster, not always, but often enough to notice. And when he woke up in the night, he found it easier to drift back to sleep. The mornings felt a touch brighter. His legs didn't feel quite as heavy on the walk to the pier, and he had a little more stamina climbing the steps back up. One evening, Emily stopped by with Max and found her father sitting in the backyard in the fading light, sipping tea by a small fire pit. "You look relaxed," she said with a smile. Robert grinned. "Melatonin therapy," he replied. "Doctor's orders, though in this case it involves sitting in the sun and watching firelight." Emily laughed, shaking her head. "You're the only person I know who could turn muscle training into candlelight and campfires." Robert shrugged. "Hey, if it works, I'm not complaining." As the days went on, Robert began to understand something Collins had been hinting at all along. Strength wasn't just built in the gym or at the dinner table. It was also built in the quiet, natural rhythms of life. In the way you slept, in the light you soaked in the gentle balance of the body's own cycles. Supporting melatonin wasn't about chasing youth. It was about giving his body back some of the tools it once had in abundance. And for Robert, that was reason enough to keep stepping outside each morning, to let the sun greet him like an old friend, and to end his days in the warm, flickering glow of a light that had been sustaining humans for centuries. Robert Lawson had always thought of sunlight as something you either enjoyed or avoided depending on the weather. On a perfect fishing day, he welcomed it like an old friend. On a blazing summer afternoon, he hid from it under a wide-brimmed hat. But now, after weeks of morning walks and quiet evenings by candlelight, he was starting to see sunlight, and particularly the invisible warmth within it, in a new way. It was Dr. Collins who had first used the term infrared light in their conversation about melatonin. Robert, he'd explained, more than half of the sunlight that reaches you is infrared light. You can't see it, but you feel it as warmth. And unlike the harsh ultraviolet rays that can damage your skin, infrared penetrates deep, 2 inches or more, right into your muscles and tissues. It can help restore energy in your cells, reduce inflammation, and yes, even stimulate your body's natural melatonin production. Robert had nodded at the time, but the words didn't really sink in until he experienced it for himself. One crisp autumn morning, after a stretch of cloudy days, the sun finally broke through. He stepped outside with his coffee and just stood there, feeling the warmth on his face. It wasn't like the dry, artificial heat of a space heater. This warmth seemed to seep inward, loosening the tension in his shoulders, calming the restless energy that often lingered in his chest. That afternoon, he decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He took an old folding chair down to the pier and sat quietly, letting the sun's rays soak into him while the tide rolled in and out. The simple act reminded him of the afternoons in his fishing days when he'd take a short break on deck, close his eyes, and let the sunlight fill him. Back then, he thought it was just a moment of relaxation. Now he realized it had been a form of natural therapy. Over dinner that evening, Robert shared the experience with Emily. "It's not just about feeling warm," he explained. "It's like the light is recharging me from the inside." Emily tilted her head with curiosity. "You sound like you're talking about solar panels," she teased. Robert grinned. "Maybe I am, just the kind made of skin and bone instead of metal." In the following days, Robert became more deliberate about seeking out his infrared time. He made it part of his morning routine, even on cooler days. He learned that the light wasn't just in the sun, it was in the flicker of a fire, the glow of a candle, even the warmth of a gas stove. One rainy evening, he lit the fireplace in his living room for the first time in years. As he sat in front of it with a mug of tea, he felt that same deep, peaceful warmth. Dr. Collins had mentioned that one of the biggest enemies of infrared's benefits was artificial blue light, the kind that came from LED bulbs, phone screens, and computer monitors. "They trick your brain into thinking it's daytime," Collins had warned. "That can shut down melatonin production when you actually need it to rise." Robert thought about his evenings, often spent scrolling through fishing forums on his phone or watching television until late. It wasn't hard to see how the glow of the screen could be drowning out the quiet signals his body needed. So he started making small changes. He turned off the television an hour earlier. He left his phone in the kitchen after dinner. In the evenings, he lit a few candles or turned on a small lamp with a warm bulb instead of flooding the room with bright white light. Within a week, he noticed something unexpected. His evenings felt calmer. His sleep came more easily. And the mornings? Oh, the mornings brought a steadier kind of energy, the sort he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the jittery energy of coffee, but a grounded, steady hum that carried him through his walk to the pier and back without that familiar heaviness in his legs. One Sunday, as he stood by the window watching Max play in the yard, Robert thought about how easy it would be to overlook all of this, how simple it was to take light for granted. And yet here he was, seeing it as a kind of medicine, not in a pill bottle, but in the way the sun rose and set each day, in the way a candle flame danced, in the way a fire's glow could warm more than just the air around it. That afternoon, he called his old fishing buddy, Frank. "You ever just sit in the sun for the sake of sitting in the sun?" Robert asked. Frank laughed. "Not since I was a kid. Why?" Robert told him about infrared light, about melatonin, about the quiet benefits he'd been feeling. Frank was skeptical at first, but by the end of the call, he promised to give it a try. Robert hung up smiling. Sharing this felt right, not as some miracle cure, but as an old truth rediscovered. The kind of truth you didn't have to buy, just remember. From then on, Robert made a pact with himself. No matter how busy the day, no matter how cold or gray the season, he would find a few moments to let the warmth in. Because now he understood that gentle, invisible light was more than just comfort. It was a quiet, steady healer, working in ways he couldn't see but could surely feel. Robert Lawson had always been an active man, but he'd never thought of himself as someone who worked out. His strength came from years of hauling fishing nets, carrying crates, and mending gear, the kind of work that built muscle without him even thinking about it. But since retiring, those natural challenges had slowly faded from his daily life. Sure, he still walked to the pier most mornings, and he kept up with chores around the house. But the heavy lifting, the real muscle-testing work had all but disappeared. One crisp morning, while sipping coffee in Dr. Collins's office, Robert asked, "So if I want to keep my strength, what's the one thing I can't skip?" Collins didn't hesitate. "Resistance training," he said firmly. "You can walk all day and keep your heart healthy, but to keep your muscles, you have to challenge them. And not just with light movement, you need to give them something to push against." Robert tilted his head. "Like lifting weights?" "Exactly," Collins said. "But it doesn't have to be barbells at the gym. It can be resistance bands, bodyweight exercises, even lifting things around the house. The key is to make your muscles work harder than they're used to. That's what tells them, we need to stay strong." That afternoon, Robert dug through his garage and found an old set of resistance bands, the kind he'd bought years ago and barely touched. He brushed off the dust and stretched one experimentally. The elastic still had some give, and he decided it was good enough to start with. The next morning, he set up a small space in his living room. He looped a band around the leg of a sturdy chair and tried pulling it toward him. At first, it felt awkward, not at all like the natural movements he was used to from years of work. But after a few repetitions, he began to feel the muscles in his arms and shoulders warming, almost waking up. For the first week, he kept it simple. A few pulls with the bands, a few squats, holding onto the back of a chair for balance, some slow push-ups against the kitchen counter. He didn't try to push too hard. Collins had warned him that too much too soon could lead to soreness or injury. "Think of it like waking up an old engine," the doctor had said. "You don't slam the accelerator, you warm it up first." Emily noticed the change before Robert did. One afternoon, she dropped by to find her father standing in the kitchen, doing slow squats while waiting for the kettle to boil. "Look at you," she said, grinning. "Training for the Olympics?" Robert laughed. "Just training for the rest of my life." By the second week, Robert started to feel a difference. The walk to the pier seemed a little easier. Lifting the grocery bags from the car didn't make his arms shake quite as much. Even his posture felt straighter, as though his body was remembering how to hold itself tall. But more than the physical changes, there was a shift in how Robert felt inside. Resistance training gave him a sense of purpose again, a small, daily challenge that felt good to complete. Each session was a quiet promise to himself that he wasn't going to let his strength slip away without a fight. One rainy afternoon, Robert invited his old friend Frank over. Frank had been curious ever since Robert mentioned the bands and the simple exercises. They set up in the living room and Robert showed him the basics. Frank grunted and groaned through the first set, but laughed at the end. "Feels harder than it looks," he admitted. Robert nodded. "That's the point. It's not about lifting the heaviest thing you can find. It's about keeping what you've got and slowly building on it." Robert also started adding small challenges to his daily routine. Carrying the laundry basket up the stairs without resting halfway. Standing from a chair without using his hands. Holding a plank position for a few seconds longer than before. Each one was a little victory, a reminder that progress didn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Collins checked in after a month and was pleased. "Your grip strength is better," he noted, shaking Robert's hand. "That's a good sign. Strong grip strength often means overall muscle health is improving." Robert grinned. "Feels good to be able to carry my own groceries without thinking twice." The doctor nodded. "That's the lifeline, Robert. Resistance training isn't just about muscles. It's about independence. Every time you make your muscles work, you're buying yourself more time to live on your own terms." That night, Robert sat at his kitchen table with his notepad again. He wrote, "Light every day, movement every day, resistance every day." It was simple, but it was becoming the rhythm of his life, a rhythm he intended to keep for as long as possible. Robert Lawson had always been a meat and potatoes kind of man, but he'd never thought much about how much protein he actually ate. In his younger days, when he was out on the water hauling in nets or repairing gear, he could eat a plate of fish, a baked potato, and half a loaf of bread without thinking twice. But in recent years, his appetite had changed. Meals were lighter, smaller, sometimes just toast and coffee in the morning or a bowl of soup for lunch. It was enough to fill his stomach, but not enough, as he was starting to learn, to feed his muscles. It was Dr. Collins who broke it down for him during one of their regular talks. "Robert," he said, "you can exercise all you want, but if you're not giving your muscles the building blocks they need, they can't grow or repair. And the main building block is protein." Robert tilted his head. "So, how much do I need?" "For someone your age," Collins explained, "aim for between 0.8 and 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight every day. For you, that's somewhere between 70 and 100 grams a day. That's more than most older adults get without thinking about it. And if you're doing resistance training, you'll be on the higher end of that range." Robert frowned slightly. 70 to 100 grams, that sounds like a lot. Collins smiled. "It's actually very doable once you know where to find it. Eggs, lean meats, fish, poultry, dairy, beans. And if you want, protein shakes can help fill the gaps. The key is to spread it through the day, not try to cram it all into one meal." That night, Robert sat at his kitchen table with his notebook and started jotting down the foods he usually ate. Toast and coffee for breakfast, maybe 10 grams of protein at best. Soup and crackers for lunch, another 10. A modest piece of chicken for dinner, maybe 25. In total, he was barely reaching half of what Collins recommended. The next morning, Robert decided to start making changes. For breakfast, instead of just toast, he scrambled 2 eggs and added a slice of cheese. He poured himself a glass of milk instead of his usual second cup of coffee. It felt hearty, but not heavy, and he realized he'd already doubled his protein intake for the morning. At lunch, he opened a can of tuna and mixed it with a little mayonnaise and chopped celery. He piled it on whole grain bread and had it with a small salad. Simple but satisfying, and another 20 grams of protein. By dinner, Robert grilled a piece of salmon and served it with roasted vegetables. As he ate, he thought about how much better this felt compared to his old habit of skipping protein at breakfast or lunch. After a week of paying attention, Robert began to notice small but encouraging changes. He didn't feel as drained in the afternoons, his post-walk fatigue was lighter, even his mood felt steadier. Emily noticed too. "Dad, you've got more energy lately," she said one evening as they cleaned up the dinner dishes. Robert smiled. "Turns out feeding your muscles actually makes a difference." One Saturday morning, Frank came by for coffee. Robert offered him a protein smoothie, something new he'd started experimenting with. "It's just milk, banana, a scoop of protein powder, and a little peanut butter," Robert explained. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Peanut butter? Now you're speaking my language." They both laughed, but Frank admitted he'd never thought about protein much either. "I just eat whatever's easy," he said. Robert nodded knowingly. "That's what I did too. But easy isn't always enough, not if you want to keep your strength." Collins had explained that as people age, their bodies become less efficient at using protein to build muscle. "That's why older adults need a bit more," he'd said. "It's like the engine still runs, but it burns fuel less efficiently. You've got to top up the tank more often." Robert took that advice seriously. He started keeping hard-boiled eggs in the fridge for a quick snack. He added Greek yogurt with berries in the afternoon instead of reaching for a cookie. Little by little, he found ways to weave protein into every meal without feeling like he was forcing himself. By the end of the month, Robert noticed that his resistance training sessions felt different. His recovery was quicker, the lingering soreness was less sharp, and he had more stamina during each set. It wasn't a miracle transformation, but it was progress, and for Robert, progress was everything. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace, Robert reflected on how much he'd learned in the past few months. Light, movement, and now protein, each piece was becoming part of a larger puzzle. It reminded him of repairing a fishing net. No single knot fixed the whole thing, but knot by knot, the net became strong again. He smiled to himself, took a sip of tea, and made a note in his notebook. Protein feeds the work, no fuel, no strength. It was a simple truth, but one he planned to live by from now on. Robert Lawson had always thought of cholesterol-rich foods as something to avoid. For decades, he'd trimmed the fat from his meat, skipped the egg yolks, and replaced butter with margarine because that's what every health article and public service announcement had told him to do. But after his recent talks with Dr. Collins, his thinking had shifted entirely. Collins had explained it in plain language. "Robert, your body needs cholesterol to build the very hormones that protect your muscles. Without enough, your hormone production suffers, and that can speed up muscle loss. The trick isn't cutting out cholesterol, it's choosing the right sources and using them wisely. At first, Robert had been skeptical, but the more he learned, the more it made sense. He could see now that his decades of avoiding certain foods might have left his body undersupplied with one of the most important raw materials for staying strong. So he decided to make a change, not by eating recklessly, but by bringing back healthy, cholesterol-rich foods that worked with his body instead of against it. The first thing he reintroduced was eggs, not just the whites, but the whole egg, golden yolk and all. One morning, he cracked 2 into a skillet, letting them sizzle gently in a little butter. The smell alone brought back memories of his younger years, when breakfast was hearty enough to carry him through long mornings at sea. He sat down at the kitchen table, took a bite, and felt oddly satisfied, not just in his stomach, but in his sense of doing something good for his body. Next came dairy. Robert had been drinking watery skim milk for years, convinced it was the healthier choice. Now he bought a bottle of whole milk from the farmer's market and a wedge of sharp cheddar from a local cheesemaker. He noticed the flavor was richer, creamier, and more satisfying. Collins had told him that dairy from good sources was not only a quality source of cholesterol, but also packed with protein and calcium, both of which his muscles and bones needed. Fish had always been a part of Robert's diet, but now he paid more attention to fattier varieties like salmon, mackerel, and sardines. These give you cholesterol and healthy fats together, Collins had explained, and they're excellent for your heart and brain too. Robert found himself enjoying them even more now that he understood their value. On Sundays, Robert treated himself to roast chicken with the skin on, something he hadn't done in years. He seasoned it simply, roasted it until golden, and served it with vegetables. Sitting at the table with Emily and the grandkids, he realized he'd been missing more than just flavor all those years he'd eaten plain, skinless chicken breasts. He'd been missing the nourishment that came with it. One rainy afternoon, Frank came over for coffee, and Robert made them a small plate of sliced cheddar and boiled eggs. As they ate, Robert explained what he'd learned. "Turns out I was cutting out the wrong things," he said. "These foods aren't the enemy. In the right amounts, they're part of the solution." Frank raised an eyebrow. "So I don't have to feel guilty about my Sunday omelets?" Robert laughed. "Not unless you're eating a dozen every morning. It's about balance." Robert noticed something else, too. By including these richer foods in his meals, he felt more satisfied and less tempted to snack on empty calories later. It wasn't just about the nutrients, it was about how those nutrients made his body feel nourished and steady. Still, Collins had reminded him to be mindful. "It's not about piling on bacon and fried foods every day," he'd said. "It's about choosing high-quality sources, eggs, dairy, fish, lean meats, and letting them be part of a balanced diet." Robert took that to heart. He made a point of pairing these foods with plenty of vegetables, whole grains, and fresh fruit, so his plate was colorful and varied. Over time, Robert began to see these foods not as indulgences, but as part of his muscle insurance plan. Each egg, each slice of cheese, each piece of salmon was a quiet investment in his strength, a way of giving his body the tools it needed to keep building and repairing muscle. One evening, as he sat in his backyard watching the sunset, Robert reflected on how far he'd come. Just months earlier, he had been afraid of cholesterol, convinced it was something to avoid at all costs. Now he understood it as one of the many partners in his fight against muscle loss, a partner that, when chosen wisely, could help him stay strong, steady, and independent for years to come. He took a sip of tea and made a note in his ever-growing notebook. "Don't fear the good stuff. Feed the strength you want to keep." It was a simple rule, but one that now felt like second nature. Robert Lawson had learned a lot in the past few months about cholesterol, protein, light, and hormones. But there was one word that still felt foreign to him: pregnenolone. Dr. Collins had mentioned it almost in passing during one of their conversations, calling it the forgotten precursor. At the time, Robert didn't think much about it, but the name stuck in his mind. It sounded like something from a chemistry textbook, not something that could have anything to do with his day-to-day life. It wasn't until his next visit that Robert decided to ask about it. Sitting across from Collins in the small, warmly lit office, he said, "Doc, you mentioned something called pregnenolone before. What exactly is that, and why does it sound like something I'd need a degree to understand?" Collins chuckled. "I can see why it sounds complicated, but pregnenolone is actually quite simple to understand once you think of it this way. It's the mother hormone. Your body uses it as the raw material to make many other hormones: testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, DHEA, even cortisol, Without enough pregnenolone, the whole hormone-making system slows down. Robert raised an eyebrow. So if my body's running low on pregnenolone, it can't make the hormones I need to keep my muscles? That's exactly right, Collins said. And here's the thing. Pregnenolone production naturally declines with age. Combine that with low cholesterol, the ingredient your body needs to make pregnenolone in the first place, and you've got a double hit against your hormone supply. That's one reason older adults can struggle with muscle loss, fatigue, and slower recovery. Robert leaned back, absorbing the information. It made sense, like a factory slowing down because it didn't have enough raw materials. Collins continued, some people choose to take pregnenolone as a supplement, especially if they're seeing signs of hormone decline. It's not as common as other supplements, partly because most folks don't know about it, and partly because it's something you should use carefully. It's much gentler than jumping straight into testosterone or estrogen therapy, but it still needs to be tailored to the person. Robert was quiet for a moment. Do you think I should take it? That depends, Collins replied. You've already made big changes. Better protein, healthy cholesterol, resistance training, more sunlight. Those are the foundation. If you're still feeling low energy and slow muscle recovery after a few more months, then we could discuss adding pregnenolone. I usually start with a low dose, for men maybe 100 milligrams a day, and monitor from there. That night, Robert sat at his kitchen table with his notebook and wrote in big letters, pregnenolone, Sarkar's mother hormone. Beneath it, he added, supports all other hormones, needs cholesterol to be made, declines with age. It felt like finding another missing piece in the puzzle. He didn't rush out to buy a supplement right away. Instead, he focused on giving his body what it needed to make pregnenolone naturally. Eating the right cholesterol-rich foods, getting enough rest, and keeping stress under control. He realized that even if he never took a pill, understanding pregnenolone gave him a deeper appreciation for how interconnected everything was. One weekend, Robert explained it to Frank over coffee. It's like running a boat, Robert said. You can have the best sails, a strong hull, and a good crew. But if you don't have the main engine working, you're not going far. Pregnenolone is that main engine for your hormones. Frank squinted. So it's not something you just take for fun. Robert laughed. Definitely not. It's something you work up to, like tuning an engine only after you've cleaned the fuel lines and replaced the old parts. First, you fix the basics. In the weeks that followed, Robert kept reading about pregnenolone. He learned it also played a role in supporting brain health and mood. That struck a chord with him. He'd noticed that on the days he felt physically stronger, his mood lifted too. It made him think that maybe all these changes weren't just helping his muscles, but his mind as well. Emily noticed it too. One evening she said, "Dad, you seem lighter these days, more yourself." Robert smiled. "I guess I am. I've been learning that staying strong isn't just about the muscles you can see. It's also about the ones you can't, the systems inside you that keep everything else running." He didn't know yet if pregnenolone supplementation would ever be part of his plan, but just knowing it existed and understanding its role made him feel more in control of his own health than he had in years. And for Robert, that feeling, that sense of steering the ship instead of drifting with the current, that was a victory in itself. When Dr. Collins first mentioned DHEA, Robert Lawson thought it sounded like something you'd hear in a pharmaceutical commercial. All capital letters, no vowels in sight. He almost dismissed it as just another supplement people took because it was trendy. But Collins didn't talk about DHEA like a fad. He spoke about it the way a ship captain might talk about a reliable first mate. Not flashy, but essential to the journey. DHEA, Collins explained during one of their afternoon appointments, is short for dehydroepiandrosterone, but don't worry about the name. Just think of it as one of your body's key building blocks for hormones. It's made from pregnenolone, and from there, your body uses it to make testosterone, estrogen, and other hormones that keep you strong, steady, and resilient. Robert nodded slowly. So if pregnenolone is the mother hormone, DHEA is like the eldest child? Collins grinned. Exactly. And just like pregnenolone, your DHEA levels drop steadily as you age. By the time you're in your 60s, you may be producing only a fraction of what you did in your 20s. That decline can mean slower muscle recovery, less energy, and even changes in mood. Robert leaned back in his chair. So how do you keep DHEA up? More sunlight? More protein? Collins chuckled. Those things help the whole system, but if someone's levels are particularly low, Supplementing can make a difference. For women, it's usually around 25 milligrams a day. For men, sometimes 50 to 100. But, and this is important, it's not something you take without monitoring. You need to keep an eye on hormone levels and adjust accordingly. It's best done under medical guidance. Robert had learned enough by now to know that rushing into supplements wasn't his style. He wanted to understand the full picture first. What kind of difference would I actually feel, he asked. For many people, Collins said, it's subtle at first. You might notice you recover faster from activity. Your stamina might improve. Some people find their mood lifts, and over time it can help you maintain muscle mass you might otherwise lose. That evening, Robert thought about the past year, the mornings he'd struggled to climb the pier steps without feeling winded, the soreness that lingered longer than it should after carrying groceries. If DHEA could help shorten that recovery time, it might be worth considering. Still, he wasn't about to start taking anything without a plan. Instead, he decided to focus on what he could do naturally to support his DHEA levels. Collins had explained that good sleep, regular resistance training, and stress management all helped. Cortisol, your main stress hormone, and DHEA share a pathway, Collins had said. If cortisol is always high because you're stressed, it can push DHEA lower. Keeping stress in check helps keep your DHEA from dipping even further. Robert took that advice seriously. He doubled down on his morning sunlight routine, kept up with his resistance band exercises, and made time for quiet evenings by the fire or with a book. He noticed that when he was calmer, he had more energy for the things he wanted to do, and his training sessions felt stronger. A few weeks later, over coffee with Frank, Robert brought it up. "Ever heard of DHEA?" he asked. Frank shook his head. "Sounds like something for race cars." Robert laughed. "No, it's a hormone. Helps keep you strong as you age. My doctor says it's one of the keys to staying on your feet." Frank leaned forward. "So you're taking it now?" "Not yet," Robert said. "I'm building the foundation first, but it's on my radar. It's one of those small things that can make a big difference if you do it right." Frank sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I guess it's like oiling the gears before they start grinding." "Exactly," Robert replied. By the end of the month, Robert was feeling steadier. His recovery after exercise seemed a touch faster, and the afternoon fatigue wasn't as heavy. He couldn't say for sure if it was just the training, the diet changes, or the better sleep, probably all of it working together. But he knew he was on the right track. He still planned to revisit the DHEA conversation with Collins in a few months. For now, he was content to keep learning, keep moving, and keep stacking small advantages on top of each other. In his notebook, he wrote, "Pregnenolone builds the base. DHEA keeps the gears turning." It wasn't a flashy truth, but it was the kind of steady, reliable wisdom Robert valued most. And as he saw it, building strength for the years ahead was less about grand gestures and more about finding and keeping these quiet allies. Robert Lawson knew by now that preserving his muscles wasn't about one miracle pill, one workout, or one superfood. It was about building a way of living, a rhythm that he could keep for the rest of his days. The kind of plan that didn't depend on chasing quick fixes, but on steady, daily choices that would quietly stack up over time. He sat at his kitchen table one Saturday morning, the pale light of early autumn filtering through the curtains, and spread his notebook out in front of him. Over the past months, that notebook had become his companion, filled with scribbled notes from Dr. Collins, grocery lists with more eggs and salmon than ever before, and small victories written in his own hand. Walked to the pier without stopping, lifted Max without strain, slept through the night. As he flipped through the pages, Robert began to see the shape of his own forever plan emerging. It wasn't complicated. In fact, that was the beauty of it. It boiled down to a few clear pillars. Things he could do, rain or shine, good day or bad, for as long as he drew breath. The first pillar was light, morning sunlight whenever the sky allowed. A walk around the block, coffee on the porch, a few minutes by the water, and in the evenings, the softer glow of firelight or candles instead of the harsh glare of screens. He'd felt the difference: calmer evenings, deeper sleep, steadier mornings. The second pillar was movement, not just walking, though that remained part of his daily rhythm, but the kind of movement that challenged his muscles. Resistance bands looped around the chair in his living room, squats while waiting for the kettle to boil, push-ups against the kitchen counter. Every little effort told his muscles, "You're still needed. Stay strong." The third pillar was fuel. He now understood that muscles weren't built from wishes. They were built from protein, healthy fats, and the right nutrients. Whole eggs, not just whites, salmon and sardines, whole milk in his tea, cheese from the market. Enough protein each day to feed his recovery. And yes, cholesterol-rich foods to keep his hormones working as they should. The fourth pillar was hormone support, not in the form of reckless supplementation, but in understanding what his body needed to keep the internal command system running. That meant knowing about pregnenolone, DHEA, melatonin, not as buzzwords, but as tools he could consider when the time was right. It meant working with Collins to watch his levels and make careful, deliberate adjustments instead of blindly guessing. The fifth pillar was rest and recovery. Robert had learned that muscles grew stronger during rest, not just during work. Early in this journey, he'd ignored his body's tired signals, thinking more was always better. Now he knew that pacing himself and sleeping deeply was just as vital as the work itself. One crisp afternoon, Robert decided to put his plan into words. He wrote at the top of a clean page, "My forever muscle preservation plan." Beneath it, he listed the pillars in neat handwriting. When he finished, he read them over and smiled. This wasn't a chore list, it was a declaration, one that made him feel less like he was fighting aging and more like he was living alongside it on his own terms. He shared the plan with Emily over Sunday dinner. She listened carefully, nodding with each point. "Dad, it's simple," she said, "but it's solid. It's something you can actually stick with." Robert grinned. "That's the point. No complicated machines, no strange powders, just habits I can keep without thinking about them too much." A week later, he showed the plan to Frank over coffee. Frank leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "Looks like you've got a captain's log for your own body," he said. Robert laughed. "That's exactly what it is, a map to keep me from drifting off course." The truth was, Robert knew there would be days when he'd be tired, when the sky would be gray, when the resistance bands would gather dust for a week. But he also knew that this plan didn't demand perfection, it only demanded persistence. And persistence was something he'd always had. One late afternoon, Robert took his notebook and walked down to the pier. The sun hung low over the water, scattering gold across the ripples. He leaned on the railing, feeling the boards solid under his feet, and thought about the years ahead. He didn't know how many he had left, none of us do, but he knew he wanted to spend them strong enough to climb these steps, to carry Max on his shoulders, to walk home with his groceries without needing to rest halfway. He had no illusions about stopping time. Age would keep moving, just as the tide would keep rising and falling. But with his plan in place, Robert felt ready. Ready to meet each day, not with fear of what he might lose, but with gratitude for what he could keep. As the wind shifted and the smell of salt and seaweed rose around him, Robert Lawson turned toward home. In his heart, he carried the quiet knowledge that strength wasn't just in the muscles of his arms or legs. It was in the choices he made, day after day, to keep himself standing tall. And that, he thought, was a kind of strength that could last a lifetime. Robert Lawson's journey began with a quiet unease, the sense that his once reliable strength was slipping away, little by little. At first, it was just small things. A heavier breath after the pier steps, a slight tremble in his hands, the looseness of his shirt sleeves. But as he looked closer, and with the guidance of Dr. Collins, he discovered the truth. Aging wasn't simply wearing him down, it was changing the very systems that kept his muscles, energy, and independence alive. Along the way, Robert uncovered the hidden forces behind strength in later life. He learned that hormones like testosterone, melatonin, pregnenolone, and DHEA quietly shape muscle health. He understood that cholesterol wasn't an enemy, but a vital ally, and that protein was the building block his muscles had been missing. He saw how sunlight and infrared light weren't just comforting, but essential, recharging his body at a cellular level. Piece by piece, Robert rebuilt his daily life. Morning sunlight, resistance training, protein-rich meals, a deeper respect for rest. Each habit was small on its own, but together they formed a lifeline, a forever plan that could carry him forward with strength and dignity. And perhaps most importantly, Robert's transformation wasn't just physical. It was in the way he faced each day, no longer with resignation, but with quiet determination. He had traded the fear of decline for the confidence of action. So if you're listening now and you've been feeling that same slow loss in your own body, let Robert's story remind you, strength is not just what you're born with. It's what you choose to keep. Because even as the years advance, you still hold the power to rise, to rebuild, and to live on your own terms.